Hello again, it's Erin Miller from the Western Quebec School Board, and this time it's my pleasure to welcome you all to Let's Talk Collections, our panel with Kelsey Bogan and Rabia Khokhar. Most of the region the Western Quebec School Board works in is unceded territory. And everything just went sideways on me. There we go. Sorry, technical glitch. Let's start again. Most of the region the Western Quebec School Board works in is unceded territory. Two of our schools, an elementary school and a high school, are in Maniwaki, which is about 2 hours north of Gatineau. Right outside Maniwaki is the First Nations community, Kitigan-Zibi. And as I was looking into it, I learned that the current chief, Chief Dylan White Duck, who has been serving the community since 2020, is the youngest man ever to hold the position. I also learned that the chief who served in 1854 to 1874 was Chief Antoine Pakinawatik, who made 3 trips to Toronto by canoe in an effort to secure his people's lands. I drive through those lands every time I visit my schools in Maniwaki, and I look forward to learning more. When I visited another school in September of this year, I was asked to work with some grade 3 and 4 students on the subject of truth and reconciliation. And as part of those sessions, as I was preparing, what really hit home for me was the importance of listening to Indigenous stories of all kinds, from all over the country, told in all kinds of ways. So to that end, I went looking for a story to share with them, and I found Mock and the Spirit of the Woods, a short animated film by Phyllis Grant, created as part of Season 2 of the National Film Board's Tailspinner series, which is dedicated to sharing stories which use vibrant animation to bring popular children's stories from a wide range of cultural communities to the screen. Each film includes education and study guides that teachers and librarians and library staff can use. I will share the link in the chat a little later so you can make note of it. This afternoon, I am very excited to welcome and introduce you to Kelsey and Rabia. Kelsey says she's the kind of librarian who loves weeding, hates shushing, and who believes that graphic novels and audiobooks count as real reading. Rabia believes that the school library plays a key role in helping all students feel reflected, represented, and seen through an asset-based lens. Rabia, will you tell us more about you and your work?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for, welcoming me into this space. My name is Rabia Khokhar. I'm an elementary teacher in Toronto, currently serving multilingual language learners in 4 different schools. I'm an equity and educational consultant, and I'm also a PhD student and really passionate about books and stories and using them to really build inclusive and equitable spaces where all folks of different identities and lived experiences are reflected. And so I feel like a lot of my work has all of those intersecting themes. And I really look forward to talking more about that today. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Wonderful. And Kelsey, would you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Of course. Hi, everybody. So I'm Kelsey Bogan. I have not figured out how to change my name in Zoom yet, so my pronouns are she, her, and I apologize for them not being there. So I'm a school librarian in Pennsylvania, United States, just outside of Philadelphia. I have been a high school librarian this is my 6th year. And when I started, I inherited a outdated collection with the intention to make big changes to the library and the way it's used. So I am a high school librarian. I do presenting. I present on all the stuff I try in my library and see how it goes, and then I get to share with other people. And this year I started adjuncting for San Jose State's MSLIS program as well, getting to teach students about all this wild stuff I try in the library, and we see how it goes. So I've been working a lot on looking at the status quo of the library and the traditions of the library, and looking at which of those things we can change to try to push the library forward into being a more true space of belonging for students. And so that includes a lot of things like looking at redeveloping policies, programs, the way we purchase, the way we read, the way we run the library. So that's been my big work for the last 6 years, is really looking at everything and how it's always been done and figuring out why and if we should still be doing it that way and what we can try instead.
That's wonderful. Thanks, Kelsey. And hello, kitten, whatever your name is. So part of the work, I wanted to discuss the work that drew us, the planning committee, to both of you to be part of this collections panel. For Rabia, I read your article in Canadian School Libraries Journal, which is titled "Weeding is an Equity Issue." And when I read that article, I was very taken with it, and I thought absolutely wanted to get in touch with you for this panel. Would you tell us a little bit about the experiences that led to you writing that article?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to share my screen if that's okay, just to put up some visuals for us. Okay, can everyone see my screen now?
Yes.
Perfect. So that's a really good question, Erin. Thank you for asking it. And this article really came about really as a way for me to reflect on some of the experiences I was having as a new teacher librarian in a school in Toronto. So I was at this school for 2 years. And, in a similar way, I kind of inherited this space that, because of various different situations, didn't necessarily have a full-time or even half-time teacher librarian. And, the library space in itself was being used as a prep delivery model. So, the library just wasn't really getting, I guess, the love and attention that it deserves and needed. And so there was a lot of outdated books, even the space itself. And so, when I got this position, my idea around what a library or a school library was or could be, my administrators and the school communities ideas around what the library was and could be were very much aligned. And so having a similar goal of seeing the school library as being, a relevant, responsive, and evolving place was something that really connected our vision for what the school library could serve in our school community, which was really racially homogenous. And so we really wanted the library to help us sort of work towards our equity goals, which was really to affirm, expand identities and lived experiences. And we felt that the library, because of its positionality, where all students in our school would have the opportunity to access it, could be a really big factor in helping us move our school along, as well as building that love, respect of reading in all of our student population. And so coming into this library, it was really outdated. But I think what was really key was having a similar vision with different stakeholders, and so then working towards that. And so the article really encompasses my own experiences as a new teacher librarian, having to weed the collection now. Year one in the library was all about purchasing new books, and it was really fun and exciting to purchase books and bring them in. But year two was really about now we have to weed the collection. There's no more space to put these books, and we really have to get rid of the outdated ones. And so there was a lot of different feelings that I was going through as I was thinking about wow, is this actually on my shoulders? It's so overwhelming. Am I even qualified to do this? Because it's such a big task, and it's such a big it was such a big collection. And so this little blurb talks a little bit about some of my feelings that I was going through. I was kind of scared of the backlash I might get because I was a new librarian, a new community member to the school. And I was getting, I was going to be getting rid of some books. And we all know that folks are really attached to books. And so it's really hard to be that person to be leading that process, even though it's so important. I think all of these feelings are really real. I was also a little bit nervous about being scrutinized because I was a racialized woman and I was in a space of leadership and positional power. And I was just, interested or I guess like nervous about how that would play out in this space and what type of pushback, if I would get pushback, what it would look like. I was also reflecting on, I love purchasing new books, and I need to have more space so students can access the space. They can see the books that we were getting because, we had a budget. So we were able to bring in and purchase these beautiful books, but they were just getting lost in the shelves. Um, and really like throughout the whole process thinking like, am I actually supposed to be doing this? And really thinking about I guess like throughout the whole thing, really thinking about the power of reading, and really thinking about how we could make it contextual and what the impact might be of that. So just I think the article really reflected a lot of my own experiences and my feelings, that I had like throughout the process. In the beginning, a lot more like nerves, but even throughout, the different, like it wasn't like a linear process. There was a lot of different feelings throughout as I was learning more, as I was, taking out more books, getting, some professional development. And so these were some of my initial ideas. And this is really what my space looked like in the beginning. So really what we had was that we had like really packed shelves, where it was really hard for students to really see like what was even on the shelves. And what I noticed was they would only go to like specific spaces because I guess that's really what they could really access, like easily access. In our collection, because it was quite outdated and it hadn't been weeded for a while, there was a lot of like stereotypical representation, particularly in the nonfiction section. There was like books that were just like yellowing with pages. And certain areas, as I looked back and I like sort of saw how kids like were using the space, I saw that there was like some interest in some areas and lack of interest in some other areas, in the nonfiction section because it was so like inaccessible. And so, this is really what it looked like. And as I was going through the process of reading, it was like a daunting task, but what I decided to do with, support from my library department was really to think about like where I was going to start and what I was going to do like on a daily basis or a weekly goal. So I think that really helped me to have like set like specific short-term and long-term goals. And just thinking critically about who I was kind of like asking for help, because oftentimes we are like the only teacher librarian in the school, and so it can feel very like nerve-wracking to have this on our shoulders. And so just reaching out to my department, like library department, even collaborating with bookstores, and really thinking about like policies and like why these books are here, what impact will it have if we get rid of them, with administrators as well as families. And so just throughout the process, these pictures sort of talk about the process of it. Like I would pull some books up. I had like different piles. There was a pile that was like unsure, which just kept like growing. But over time, the process became a little bit easier over time. Like in the beginning, it was quite daunting, but as I kind of got into it, it became a little bit easier and more manageable. And I think that's really what I wanted to like articulate in the article was just, it's a process, and we're never necessarily done, because weeding really has to become, like integral and ongoing to our process. And so even though we have like short-term and long-term goals, we're always in the process. Like our mindset always has to be that we're constantly like being relevant, responsive, and evolving. Like the library isn't necessarily like a museum, but it's something that's really evolving and like alive and active. And so weeding then has to be, a continued process. And once we started making these changes, we noticed that, our bookshelves became more accessible for our kindergarten to grade 6 students. And because they became more accessible, they promoted more like independence in our student body. The library space itself just became more open, more welcoming. It was like we had less books, but the books were really based on like student interest and positive representation. And so like, even if we had like less books, they were being engaged with more. And so that was really the beauty of it. And really, our collection was starting to become relevant and responsive, that it was affirming as well as expanding our students' identities and lived experiences. And so these are just some like after pictures of the space. We noticed that we could display a lot more like around the space, so that, kids could kind of like interact with new books, and they could just see different books like embedded everywhere. And so, this is just another picture of some of the new, the changes. Like, I think weeding really brought like our space to life. Like, it just made it more welcoming, more inclusive, more accessible. And it then like helped us further think about where our next steps would be. And so I think the article really helped me reflect on this process, but also just it provided me with like steps if I, need to do this work again, or what I could add to it. Just I think it helped me like think critically about the process of it. Yeah, and I'll just stop sharing.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rabia. That's it's true. It's I was in preparation, I was looking through both of your websites quite a bit, and I noticed that Kelsey had a recent post on dynamic shelving, which I hope we can talk about a little bit later, because it's so true, isn't it? I mean, it's like I've heard people liken weeding the library collection to a garden, and you have to weed it from time to time so that the rest of the plants in the garden can grow healthy and full, right? So that's wonderful. Thank you very much for sharing that process. Kelsey, what was brought forward to the committee for as a suggestion for your work was your wonderful website, Don't You Shush Me, and specifically the really in-depth diversity audit that you did in your library. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, it's the most viewed blog post that I have for sure. There's a big demand. So when I was hired at my high school, it was definitely with the intention that the school knew the library could be more than it was, but they didn't know exactly what it should be or how to work it. So I've enjoyed a lot of freedom and support in trying a lot of different things, and fortunate to have funding. And so similar to what Rabia was talking about, when I started purchasing, one of the first things I did, right, was to start purchasing. And I got my master's in library science in 2015. And so We Need Diverse Books conversations were something that I was kind of onboarding into at that time. And so I thought I was purchasing diversely. I was trying to actively. And so I thought, okay, good start. And then the first year or two, then I started to do the big weeding. And then when we're in like my third or fourth year, we had in the United States, we've had a lot of Black Lives Matter protests. And right before the pandemic or during the pandemic, our students had a pretty significant response. And kind of a outcry and like a demand for in their schooling, better representation, better, just better. And so that got my wheels started to think, well, okay, obviously we need to be doing something different, something better. So what can I do as a librarian? And I started to think about the representation, and I was like, well, I'm buying diversely, I think, but how do I really know? And I didn't really know. We're librarians, library of science, and I didn't have any data. I didn't have data on my collection to really know. And so I started to hear about diversity audits. So I started to play around and try to learn about them. And what I found was frustrating because people were talking about diversity audits and how important diversity audits are. But there were like no guides, like, okay, here's literally the steps for how you do it. So of course, then I was hyper fixated and focused on it. And so I decided to figure it out and to write up a guide so that other people would have a guide for next time. So that's on the blog post. It is literally like the steps of literally what I did to do a diversity audit, which is helpful because it's very overwhelming to even know where to start. So I started to read what I could, attend the PDs I could, and try to learn. And then I just dove in and started to audit the books, literally one book at a time, deciding which kinds of, it's really, diversity audit is kind of a tough word. It's really like a representation audit. I'm really looking to see which kinds of perspectives and voices are represented in our collection. So it really a representation audit is a little bit more of an accurate term, I think. So I chose different kinds of representations based on what students often ask for, what there's often demand for. And that's how I started. Like, well, let me see, do we even have this on our shelves? And if we do have this representation on our shelves, whether in the author or the main character, is it even good representation? As Rabia talked about, stereotypical representation is a real issue, especially with some of the more dated books. So my audit was pretty comprehensive and huge. And of course, we have to do different versions of it and what we can do and what we can't do. But I did a pretty big one. And so I looked for like poor representation, stereotypical representation. Like I made notes of that so I could go and look at if those books needed to be weeded or what needed to happen for those. So it was a pretty big project. The data that I collected has been invaluable. I mean, completely worth the time it took to do it. I use it all the time. I use the data to inform my purchasing. I use the data to inform my targeted weeding, things that maybe we need to look at for possible weeding. Not every book gets weeded just because it might have some kind of, representation in it, but it's another factor. So I'm just real quick, I'm just going to share my screen to share some of the data because I think it helps contextualize what I'm talking about when people can see some of the data that we found, and you'll see, unsurprisingly, what we found here, which is my initial data found 87% of the authors, this is only for fiction, by the way, 87% of our authors were white or assumed white. Obviously, it's not always clearly evident. People don't always identify themselves that way clearly. 57% were female, which is not surprising because in the young adult world, high school world, there is a little bit more of a representation of female authors compared to male. And I also did main character. So I looked at author and main character. So here for the main characters, main POV characters, 81% of the main characters in our collection were white. And then on the side, you can see some of the other representation that I was able to find. And this is how I use it. This is how I put the data so I can use it. So this is how I had to, once I had the data, I had to figure out what to do with it. Like we needed goals. And people always ask me, well, what's the goal? Like how much representation is enough representation? And like the answer is there's never enough. There's always, we can do more. But still I needed some kind of a baseline contextualization. So what I did was I pulled the United States population demographic data from the census, and I put that to compare some of my data to, so I could see if we were even close to being proportionate to at least our country's representation, just as a starting point. And of course, I found that in most cases, our collection was not close. So this really helped me see, because I thought I was purchasing really diversely. And so this data, and then I divided it by genre, it really helped me see that I wasn't purchasing as well as I thought, because my own biases are getting in the way. Like you can see, we have a large population of Latinx students in our school, and yet very, very, very few amounts of that representation present in our collection. And I was purchasing, and my bias was just blocking it. I wasn't seeing it. I wasn't buying it. So without this data, I wouldn't have seen my own unconscious bias. I wouldn't have noticed that I was missing that representation. I wasn't even purchasing it. So that's what the data really helped me. I did not time myself. I have no idea how long I talked on that. I'm sorry.
No worries at all. No worries at all. Thank you. I mean, that's a tremendous amount of work. And I think of my own sort of hurricane meeting style, which is more, what is this? Get it off the shelf. Yours is far more useful. Thank you for sharing that. How long did it take? I know you mentioned it in one of your blog posts, but how long did it take you all in all?
So I did it right during the lockdowns, the shutdowns in the United States for COVID. So it's all kind of a blur. But I usually, when I teach other people to do it, I say like the goal isn't to be perfect with the data. It's not like to spend 20 minutes on one book trying to find every piece of information you can about it. The goal is to try to just do quick scans to gather what you can. So I usually recommend that people spend 1 to 3 minutes tops per book. So I think I audited 1,700 or 2,000 titles or something. So times that by 3 minutes, I guess that's probably about how much time. Although sometimes I get stubborn and I'd be like digging in 20 minutes on one title, and other times I'd find a blog post that had everything and it was really quick. So just kind of balance. But that's usually my recommendation, is like, the goal isn't to be perfect. Like this, we're not trying to create a database of everybody's identities. That's not the goal. That's not possible. It's not even like ethical, probably. That's not the purpose, right? The purpose is just to try to get some data to help you see what you have and what you're missing. So that sometimes we can be perfectionists. So try to steer people away from trying to get every book perfectly detailed.
It's true. Let me just make a note of that. Don't be a perfectionist. Okay. So thank you both very much. So I'm gonna throw the same question to both of you. So it's been a while since this collection work that you both did was completed, and your reflections were published. What have you been working on and learning since then? And have you come across any resources that have inspired you? Any challenges you have faced since you did that work, Kelsey?
Yeah, so it's definitely ongoing. Like I when I say I completed the audit, it's like completing weeding. We never complete it, right? It's like completing purchasing. It's never done. But I completed what I say is the initial audit, and now it's ongoing. So when I sit down to put a purchase order in, I'm doing an audit on the new purchases and adding that to the audit. So it's continual. But I have shifted gears a little bit to my focus. I'm trying to shift over into nonfiction a little bit and deciding. I'm not sure how I want to approach nonfiction, if I want to do an official formal audit or something different. I'm playing with some ideas right now. I've been doing a lot of work on ditching Dewey. So that's been a big focus the last year and a half since the audit. That's been kind of my fixation. So I've been really trying to explore our options for that. And it's hard because the profession hasn't really committed to a new standard. So it's kind of a lot of us just trying different things on our own. So I've been exploring different categorizations and trying different things. So that's really been my focus. And I'm also working on specifying some of the audit. Like when I did it, I had a category for LGBTQIA+, on my audit, but that's a big umbrella term. So now I'm working on going through that and trying to see what intersectional representation we have in there, because my students will often come and say like, oh, I would like, what books do you have with non-binary characters? And so that single umbrella isn't really helping them find that. So now that's where I'm digging in for more specificity.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Rabia?
I guess in a similar way, I'm also really interested in just how things are like categorized and like displayed in the school library. So, when I think about the entire library collection, I think it tells like a story. And I think this story can affirm and expand identities of our learners, as well as like local and broader communities. So I'm really interested in like how things are categorized, what themes we might use, how we sort of like center voices during different parts of the year. And so, I keep going back to this idea that like the book collection in the school library is a story of community, which communities are represented, when are they represented? And so I'm sort of starting to play with this idea that like, we have different representation within our community, and then during different times of the year, whether it's like, maybe it's like Islamic Heritage Month or different like important days or times of the year, we can highlight different like books and different members of our communities. but after they still go back into our collection that sort of talks about our community. And so I'm just interested in like how we're centering voices, how we're categorizing, where we're categorizing in the physical space as well of the library. So I guess I'm just sort of like thinking about that and playing around with that. And just, going from that, I'm also really interested in thinking differently about how to categorize nonfiction. But like Kelsey, I really don't know like where that's gonna go. Like in the elementary years, I think just having themes that are accessible for students would be so like tangible for them. So I'm kind of like interested in how that can come and play, but still being synchronized with the school board, and like how, what impact and role could that have, and kind of still like following like the system in a way, I guess, so that students can still access and navigate the space. And that, they can kind of go into any library space and still access it in a similar way, that they would have the skills and tools to do that. So I guess I'm interested in those types of things. And one other thing that I'm really passionate about is like, now that we've like purchased these beautiful books, how do we embed them in our curriculum, and how do we bring them to practice? So that's kind of my passion, is really, we have the books, we're displaying them, and now how are we like using them and bringing them into our curriculum and our learning experiences?
Very much so, yeah. At the beginning of the session, I meant to make the announcement that we would go until about 1:55 or so, and then take a quick little stretch break. This is a long session, not nearly long enough. None of them have been today. I wish they could all be longer, but really quickly, unconscious bias came up earlier. And I think I know for myself, that's something that I, if I'm honest, I can recognize, but I can't really define. Can either one of you sort of, can we sum it up in a way that is easy to understand? Or is it just too big? Because it's the result of my lived experience, right? And what truth was accessible to me, right? And I think, and we all have that, and we all come to a different place. Do you have any idea about how do we tackle that?
It's hard, I think, because it is unconscious. And so trying to develop the habit and skill and intention of reflecting, for me, it's I try to be I'm very self-reflective in my practice in general. That's why the blog, I never even intended other people to read it. I just blogged because I wanted to remember what I had done and why I had done things, so I could reflect back on it. And it ended up being helpful to other people. But I think putting that even to our thinking really helps. I keep reminding myself all the time, anytime I assume something or expect something or think a certain thing, I'm trying to remind myself to take a pause and question myself on that. Like, why do I think that? Why did I assume that? What other assumptions might other people have on that? Like, I'm very much a product of my upbringing and my experience and where I've come from. And it's important you have to consciously remind yourself that we didn't all have that exact same experience. So it does require a lot of intention and self-reflection on your own thinking. Like, you have to stop your own thinking in a way, be like, wait, why did I just think that? Like, I even catch myself with stereotypes sometimes. Like, I catch it now. I'm starting to learn how to catch my own brain in it, but it isn't something that you're just going to get better at if you're not intentionally retraining your thought processes. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot to keep reminding yourself all the time to like question why you're thinking the things you're thinking and why you're doing the things you're doing. And I think that's important in librarianship too. We have all these traditions and all these things we've always done and the way things have always been done that it seems like a lot of people just keep doing without questioning. So I just think bringing that intentional questioning to everything is helping me try to identify it. But how to define the term itself is like, yeah, it's hard.
Rabia, do you have any thoughts on that?
I would agree. I think it's hard to define, but I think it really has to do with, how our lived experiences, and because of our lived experiences, like what do we see, what do we notice, what do we miss, what are the reasons why? And I'll give an example. So, a few years ago, we were sort of like becoming more intentional in ensuring that we had like authentic Black representation in our book collection through authors and illustrators. And, you know, as I was doing this work of like purchasing or even like pulling out books to display, I had to like first like recognize and center myself in the work. Like I had to think about my own positionality. Like I'm not a Black person. And that really informed like the types of books that I was gravitating towards and the types of books that I was missing. So I noticed there was a pattern, like I was kind of gravitating more towards certain type of books with different themes, with different types of representation. And I really had to take a step back and reflect on like why those books were like my number one choice, or why I was gravitating towards that. And I had to sort of like take a step back and really reflect on like our context. Like once I sort of positioned myself within this work, I had to think about like my school context and the type of stories that I wanted to bring in. And because we have so much power as like librarians to choose, I think we have to do our own work, because once we do our own reflection and work, like why are we making these choices? It has a direct impact on like what we purchase and what students have access to. And so when I was sort of reflecting on like the types of books I was maybe gravitating more towards because of my biases, taking that step back and researching, and tapping into like community knowledge through like local bookstores, and trying to find out how I could like amplify voices of like diverse and dynamic Black authors, illustrators. That was kind of like the way. So I think it's like super hard to define, but I think what helped me was like positioning myself with my identities into the project or the work I wanted to do, and then thinking about my context, like what type of books do I want to bring to this specific student body and audience, and once again, how do they affirm and expand, who they see, how they see people. So those were some of the big questions, but no real definite like definition.
It's a huge concept. I really appreciate both of you just jumping in with me on that one, because that wasn't a question we had necessarily talked about. It is 1:54. Everyone, I'm going to give you a 3 to 5 minute break just to get up, stretch, grab some more water. And when we get back, some of you sent in questions when you registered for the symposium, and we went through those questions and looked at, some of them were quite similar, so we put them together, and we sort of used them to shape this second part of our time together today. The goal is hopefully to get through them in enough time to leave more questions, some live questions, whether it's in the chat or if you'd like, again, just use the raise hand feature and we'll get to your question live. So take a few minutes. We'll start back for sure at 2:00 and dive into some more of collections with a diversity lens. Thank you so much, everyone. Welcome back, everybody. I've dropped some links into the chat for you. That's the article that we chatted about with Rabia, Kelsey's blog post about her diversity audit, and as well the Indigenous film that I mentioned in the land acknowledgement. They're all there for you now. All right. You both mentioned belonging in your work. I'd love to dig into that a little more. Rabia, can we start with you this time? Can you tell us a little bit about your bingo guide?
Yeah, I will just share my screen again. So, you're right. Belonging is such an important concept. I think it's really one of the ways that we can move towards more inclusive and equitable spaces for all people. And I think, belonging is something that we really think critically about in all with all grades. And especially like elementary grades where, most of my experiences where, educators will be in the process of setting up a community, and belonging is like a key element of building a community that's reflective, responsive, where you can feel safe, where you can build, where you can bring all parts of yourself, and you don't necessarily have to leave something at the door, but you have a space in your classroom or your school library or any other place. You have a space and you don't have to change any parts of who you are. And that's really my ideas around belonging. And so I wanted to sort of like design like a fun like activity or like a resource that educators or students or anyone looking to read more books or looking to understand belonging a little bit more could like tap into it. And so this is kind of like what the resource looked like. There's like intentionally and carefully curated books that have the overall theme of belonging. And so it's really reflective of like the type of community or communities that we want to build, where we really center belonging for all people of all identities, lived experiences. And that was really like the mindset that I was taking. I know that educators spend a lot of time building their communities. And I think that books are really great tools that can help us think about what belonging looks like, what it sounds like, what it feels like. But books can also show us, people who always find a sense of belonging, and some people who really don't find a sense of belonging. And books can kind of be those tangible tools that can help us springboard conversations around, why some people might not find a sense of belonging in those particular spaces or experiences. And I think one of the most beautiful things books can do is they can provide us with a blueprint of what we can do to create more belonging for everyone, like the individual actions we can take individually, group actions, and other systemic actions, like focused on like which rules might need to be changed. And so, when I was sort of curating this bingo guide, I just wanted it to be like a fun, accessible resource that educators or children or students or families or librarians could bring in their own capacities in their own way. And so all of the books really, deal with the theme of belonging, but looking at it in different ways and centering different voices, centering different experiences. And so, some of those books, like one example of the book is like how to apologize, and like, belonging and building a community. That's like a key element of that. Another book was like, I'm just like choosing one where it was like, hard to choose. They're also amazing. But, another one was like You Hold Me Up, which is really about like what we all deserve and what we all need to be thriving members of any community we might be part of. And another book was like Our Skin, and that really talks about like it's an accessible way to talk about racism and race and how that can impact if you find a sense of belonging or not. And so I guess this theme of belonging is really like important to me and like my own lived experiences. And so I wanted to, I guess, like talk back to the theme of belonging and create something fun that different like stakeholders could bring in their own ways, and continue to like think critically and build what belonging looks like, and investigate and think about our own actions of how we can use books to show us how to build more inclusive communities. So that was kind of like some of the thinking around this guide.
It's a wonderful resource. Thank you so much. Kelsey, in your blog post, Belonging in the Library, you mentioned some framework questions. When I read that blog post, I love frameworks. Give me a good framework any day. Could you walk us through those questions and tell us about their development?
Sure. Is my slide showing?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So as I said before, I've really focused on developing the library as a community space, moving it away from like the book warehouse mentality and more towards it being like as a physical and virtual community space for our students, something I think is very lacking, especially for high school students. I remember vividly, I don't know if you all remember if it was the same for you, but I was from a small town, and I remember vividly once you turned into a teenager, there were almost no spaces where you were welcome or encouraged to be. I remember we used to hang out at this donut shop's lobby and until like midnight, and then they started closing the lobby at 9 to deter teenagers from coming. We used to hang out at this playground, and literally the cops started shutting the lights off at 9 and doing drive-bys to chase you out. There's just this lack of space where you belonged and that belonged to you. And so that's really the main way I try to run the library, is to try to run it as to be developed as a true community space for the kids, the teenagers. So I think I was starting to think about it. If you want to develop this as a community space, you have to think about this being a space to belong. So then I started playing with the questions of, well, what does that mean? You know, who does the library belong to? Who belongs in the library? And how do my students know that they do? How am I making sure that they know? Especially for teenagers where they're typically not welcome to places. How would I make a space or help build a space where they knew without question that this was their space? So these are some of the questions I started to work with and play with it. These are the questions I keep in with this self-reflective practice. As I said, trying to always ask myself these questions helps guide. So one of them is, okay, well, how do my students know that they belong in the library and that the library belongs to them? Like, how? How do they actually know? Some of the other questions that led to was, well, do they see themselves reflected on the shelves? Do they see themselves reflected in every genre? Do they see themselves reflected without harmful stereotypes? Are they only seeing characters like them in realistic fiction, adversity, trauma situations? Or are they seeing characters like them training dragons and solving crimes and toppling dystopian regimes too? Do my students see their cultures, beliefs, identities, their priorities, the things they think are important, being celebrated in the library and by the library? Do they see these things being given pride of place, being given equal space? Do they see this happening authentically all year long, or as one small display once a month, 1 month out of the year? Do my students see their librarian verbally, vocally, actively, intentionally going to bat for them, for their rights, their right to be represented, their right to feel welcome, to fit in, to belong? And mostly when I'm trying to do collection development, I'm thinking, if a student asked me for a book with a main character just like them, whatever they meant by that, would I have a book to hand them? Would I have more than one book to hand them? How do I make sure that they know and see without question that they are represented here, they belong here, that's how you know. I started by asking myself, how do I know when I belong somewhere, when somewhere is meant for me to be? I'm a fat white woman. And so do I feel like I belong in a space that has very narrow aisles between the seats, or that has seats that are too thin, or that have, lots of promotion of weight loss and thin culture on the posters on the wall? No, I would not feel like I belonged in a space like that. I wouldn't feel like a space like that wanted me. So that's what sparked my initial thoughts. Well, how do my students know then that this space belongs to them? I have to see what matters to them when they tell me, because they will tell you if you ask the people you're serving, they'll tell you what's important to them if you listen. And so, my students, what's important to them? It's important that they have a space they're not being attacked, like, oh, why are you here? What do you need to do here? Are you here to study? Oh, then get back to class. Are you here? Wake up. Why are you sleeping? Like that stuff, that's not what they need. They tell me what they need. So that's what I try to develop for them. So it goes beyond the collection. This is about collection. So I've mostly focused on collections, but same kind of questions for your programming, your policies. Like that's the kind of thing I'm always like, well, we had fines when I started. Well, why? Why did we have fines? Who are those fines serving? So just kind of questioning all of that. Like, who does this make feel like they belong, and who does it exclude? And applying those questions to your collection, your policies, your programs. So it's a lot of work, a lot of digging at what's already there and what you're doing and what maybe you can change. But it makes a difference to developing that sense of community, that sense of, oh, I belong here, no question.
Absolutely. That's there's a lot of things that in the sessions I've been to today, excuse me, are coming up. I mean, this whole year, intention has been sort of ringing its bell in my ear all year long. But today, a number of times I've heard calls to listen, like you just said. I mean, I think that if we ask the question, right, what books do you want to see? If we know that they are comfortable to come in and ask us, right, it's going to make a huge difference. It's not the end all be all. We still have our work to do, but giving them a place where they can feel safe doing that is so important. All right. So this question came in from some attendees in various forms. People worded it in different ways. So I've kind of smushed it together. But essentially, folks are curious about how to go about promoting diverse titles and what suggestions you may have to get those books off the shelf and into student hands. Kelsey, what do you think?
Yeah, this is such a big question. This question is asked every time that I talk about trying to develop, good inclusive collections, and then the next question is like, okay, I got the funding, I bought the books. Now what? Or people will say, well, my community is very homogenous racially or culturally, and so how do I get these great books to circulate? And so I've been working through that, a couple of those things too, because I had the same issues. Our school community is not completely homogenous racially, but it's probably about 80% white. And so there is, if I'm working to make my collection more inclusive and diverse, especially racially and culturally, then how do I get, students to still relate to the books or check them out or however you want to say. So I'm going to share my screen real quick if that's okay, because I do have a slide for this because it gets asked a lot. I'm going to share my sound as well. Okay. So just like with anything, a bunch of different kinds of things, you have to be kind of employing a multi-pronged attack for this. But one of the first things I do is I try to have as many front-facing books as possible. I really believe strongly that every time we show a book, talk about a book, front face a book, display a book, take a picture of a book, put it on our Instagram, every one of those is an opportunity to amplify and center voices and perspectives and stories that otherwise aren't typically centered. So when I worked on reorganizing my collection to be more dynamic shelving, a lot more front-facing books like a bookstore, I'm intentional about which books I choose to front face, which books go on the displays, which books I book talk on the TikTok or the Instagram. And so I'm not going to typically choose a book that's from an author that already gets a lot of that kind of marketing, which is typically going to be, authors that have a lot of privileges. So if a new Stephen King book comes out, I'm probably not going to put that one on a display space or do a book talk on it, or, I'm going to use that opportunity in that space to center and amplify the books that, might have more perspectives and voices from people that are more systemically excluded from those kinds of marketing and spaces. So that's a big thing, is like really use your space and your time intentionally, and on like the books that you display, the books you book talk, the ones you give attention to are the ones that your community will start to notice more. We've all noticed, if you front face books, they often are the most common ones to get selected for checkout, because we do judge books by their covers and we like to see the book's covers. So I try to really use that space intentionally and purposefully choosing, what people would say are diverse books for those highlights. Every single display, should be inclusive, like every time. if you pick a quick, oh, here's some great fantasy books, like you better make sure that those fantasy books are not all just white girls, falling in love with fey princes or whatever is popular on TikTok these days. You want to make sure every topic, every display, there's lots of great intersectional representation. Making sure that the recommendations you choose are inclusive. Like when a student comes in and says, I really want something horror, can you make some recommendations? And I pick 3 books to give a quick book talk on. I make sure that I'm not choosing 3 books from like a homogenous set of voices. Like I need to make sure that I'm reading these books too, so that I could be recommending them. And number one tip, if you take nothing else away, this is the number one thing I've learned. We should not focus on the fact of a book's inclusive representation when we book talk it. We should focus on what makes it a great book. I think this is one of the biggest mistakes we make as librarians, maybe because a lot of us are white women, and maybe, I don't know if there's an awkwardness, but often we'll pick a book and be like, oh, this is great. This book is great. It's a great, diverse book. It's like, okay, well, that doesn't tell the person anything about what makes the book great, right? It doesn't tell them about the great characterization, the great plot, the twists, the turns, the adventure. That's one of the biggest mistakes I think we made. And actually, if I can just take 30 seconds to just play, this is a TikTok from one of my favorite TikTokers, Adania. She's at chai.reads on TikTok. And I think she just explains it really well, but she speaks very softly. So I have the volume up as far as I can go, but she explains it, I think, very well here.
Diverse books are really done a disservice on this app because people will hold up a book and be like, oh my god, read this book. It's fill in the blank with the marginalized community it's representing, and that's it. You don't find anything about the book. You don't know why the person liked it. It's just like, well, look at me. I have a book that features a queer person, features a black person, features Latinx representation. Aren't I great? And like, I'm proud of you for diversifying your shelves or whatever, but at the same time, you're making it like a pity buy, as if these writers and these books aren't incredible stories that can stand on their own. And it's just kind of weird.
So Dania gave me permission to use that, and her conversations on this are some of the things that got me rethinking like how I was book talking books, and if I was really focusing on what made them great. Like the representation inside isn't even always necessarily important in the book talk. Like if it is important to the story, then great, but it's not always important. It could just be a great fantasy because of X, Y, and Z, right? So like we would never pick a book by Stephen King and say, oh, you should try this one. It's a great horror written by a white guy. Like we would never book talk a book that way. But I feel like we do that sometimes with books that are written by people of color or other excluded communities. So that's some of the stuff I've been learning and trying to employ. And I think it does work. I do little audits on our checkouts, and we typically about 50%, at least 50% of our circulations are books that people would call diverse books, like with some of those representations. So even though our school community is not 50%, 50, whatever, we're still circulating because the books are great. They have great characters. They have great stories. They have great plots. They have interests that, that's what really appeals to readers anyway. So that's some of the stuff I've learned. I probably talked too long on that. Sorry.
It's all good. It's wonderful. Thank you, Kelsey. Rabia, what do you think?
Yeah, I would really agree with Kelsey. I think you did such a great job of just showing like the importance of that. And I think for me, when I was sort of like learning about this, I really had to take a step and just rethink like the word diversity as well. There's an author, Chad Everett, who talks about like how he doesn't give out diverse book lists. And I think for me, it was really about like thinking critically about like what does diversity mean? And is diversity sort of, are we using it in a way that we're creating binaries, like everything that's diverse, like racialized, people of color is like on one side and then everything white is on the other side. So I think in the library, I think we need to take some time to like really rethink diversity, because there's all types of diversity, racial, cultural, religious, gender, all of these different diversities. And so I think step one for me was to like really rethink the term and then consider how I was like using that to then display or to book talk or to show students the different types of books that were in our space. And at the elementary level, it was really like really thinking critically about intentional curation or intentionally pointing out specific books. So if we have displays, like teaching students to, like it's okay to take those books, and just, thinking critically about like who is displayed, and are we displaying just during those specific holidays or events. Like that's important, like when we're spotlighting our communities. But how else are we displaying folks? And are people only being seen during those different times of the year, or are we intentionally curating, based on universal themes that, like, students can recognize, like friendship? Like if we're talking and making a display about friendship, then who is included in what it means to be a friend? When we're thinking about teamwork, or when we're thinking about community, like who is represented. Like community helpers is a big thing in elementary school. So which community helpers are represented and reflected? And so I think for me, it was really just those intentional choices for students, particularly like what was displayed, because, students always want the things that are displayed, and they're going to go towards that more. So like, what are we displaying? And then also like, because our role is quite collaborative with classroom teachers, helping and providing teachers with, tools that they can embed within their curriculum topics, and just do things differently. So if grade 1, the unit is community helpers, really thinking critically about like who have we often centered as community helpers? Are they relatable to the community that we're serving? And how can we just bring in these beautiful books and just embed them within our learning experiences? And so I think a lot of it was just, key reflection on how the space was being used, what type of books were being pulled out, what themes we're using to categorize or display them, where we're displaying them, and then just really supporting educators with embedding these books within your curriculum topics or within the read alouds, is just like normalizing experiences and not othering. Not saying like these are all of my diverse books, but rather incorporating and embedding them into all parts of our collection was something that was really, it's like time consuming, but it's really like the impact is really worth it, because I think it's that when we embed into all aspects of our collection, that's where really folks of all identities, lived experiences are like normalized. And I think it really restores dignity and humanity, instead of like othering and just being seen sometimes. So I think those would be some of the tips.
That's wonderful. It leads quite well into the next question that we had come up, and again, it came up a couple of times. The question of genreification, specifically about stickering, labeling, and organizing diverse titles. For example, LGBTQ2+ books. What are your thoughts on genreification when it comes to diversity? And is it another way that communities can be othered? Rabia, what do you think?
I think this is like a really big question, and I'm still struggling with what I think is maybe like the thing to do. But I think it's important to think about how we're labeling, like what are the words and terminologies that we're using? And are we looking to the communities that we're serving or the communities that we're trying to represent to kind of help us name and label like how they want to be represented? But I guess at the elementary level, I'm really focused a lot on like those universal like themes, and just incorporating and reflecting all types of identities and experiences within those themes, and having that embedded throughout the collection. And then just, I guess, like intentionally curating like displays that shows like different experiences or based on something. So I think it really depends. Like I know it's something that I have to think more critically about, because it's a very fine balance of like othering And like it can be helpful in some ways where, you know, you're coming into the library and you need a particular voice or a particular book and you can kind of like navigate it accessibly. But then what is like the bigger impact of that? Like our goal should be to see all people, all experiences throughout the collection and in all parts of the library. And so I guess I'm more focused on just embedding voices throughout the collection.
That's great. Thanks, Rabia. Kelsey, I know you did it. There was a blog post that you did. You have done some work on genreification in your library.
Yeah, I don't, none of the learning that I've done in the recent years has indicated that we should be physically labeling or separating books according to representation. Most of the things I'm seeing are saying that that's not best practice when it comes to physical labels or physical organization. So for instance, like I've genreified, but like people's identities aren't a genre, you know? So like, I don't want, like, I know this is, people have big feelings about this either way, but when I teach my students, I teach them that we shouldn't be doing that because it feels more like let's say you have an LGBT plus genre, then does that mean there's no queer representation in your other genres? So if somebody is looking for a great sci-fi book, they'll never find a great sci-fi book with queer representation in the sci-fi section. Like that's a huge problem. I feel like the labels can deter or act like a warning in a way. Like if I have a student that's not actively looking for queer representation and I have a big rainbow sticker on the books, even if they are in their regular genres, and the book is exactly the kind of book this student would love to read, are they just going to not pick it because it has a rainbow sticker and then miss out on potentially a really excellent book that may expose them to representation they wouldn't otherwise have exposed to? Do you know what I mean? So for me, that's what I'm thinking. When I'm thinking of trying to build an inclusive collection, I'm thinking inclusive has to include. It has to have everybody included in sort of a similar way. So for physical labeling and separating, I don't do that for these kind of identities. I use digital tags as a kind of to try to still provide the access for people that are actively searching, so that I feels like if right now it's like the happy medium I've been able to find. It's like, okay, it's still somewhat problematic because you're still labeling things that it's hard to label really ethically, I think, in any way. But, you know, I do have students that are like, well, I want to see which books have non-binary characters. So in the catalog, it's good that they can search that, you know. So that's what I've been working on, is getting my cataloging to have really easy ways to browse for those things. But that isn't reflective on the physical shelves. Although I do sometimes do pull-out displays. So like I have a semi-permanent, my students call it the big gay display. And it's, you know, it's a wall where there's always books with queer rep displayed there, but they don't live there permanently. They have their normal sections, and then we put some on the display wall. And when they get checked out, then there's a gap, and then we put a new one up. So it's like for the students who are actively searching for certain rep, it could be nice to have like a semi-permanent rotating display. If there are certain kinds of requests you get a lot from your community, like if your community really has a real hunger for, you know, Indigenous representation, and it might make sense to have a semi-permanent, I think, rotating display, but that maybe isn't like okay, this is a genre and every book is always just here. So to me, those are some of the happy mediums I've been playing with to try to meet, you know, the best of both worlds as much as possible, I guess. But my goal is that a student should walk up to the collection and be as likely to pick a book with X representation as with Y representation, that they shouldn't have to seek out specific sections where, because to me that just feels like segregation of a collection, literally, you know. So yeah, there's a lot of big questions for this stuff, but we're all trying to learn and work through it.
Absolutely. Thank you both. So again, I love how all of these are just flowing into the next. The question that came in was, what are specific subjects we should be using or altering when we're cataloging to be allies? It ties in with what you were both just talking about. we could discuss subject headings fairly Dewey as well, right? And nonfiction. Kelsey, what do you think?
So yeah, I've just started dipping my toes into this side of things now, so I'm very much just starting to learn, but subject headings is a goal for me to look at in the next 2 years. The one that is like the famous one, at least in the US, is we have a subject heading for illegal aliens, and like that's not terminology we really want to be using. And so we had a court case ruling on whether the Library of Congress would change it, and then they did, and then they got pressured to not change it, and now I think they have officially changed it, so it's a little bit up in the air. But looking for things like that in my subject headings is a goal going forward. Of course, I could see a tag and not know it's problematic, so there's a lot of learning that has to happen for me to be able to do that. The other section I've been looking at is the way, as I said, with organizing nonfiction, I've been really trying to work hard to. If you know me at all, I am not a fan of the Dewey Decimal System. And so I have like a lot of big feelings about the way Dewey organizes things and the way he, especially with books on, queer topics and mental health topics and religion. I have, so I'm working through that, trying to find more equitable and less biased ways of organizing, like which words, as you said, which words we choose. And so like, for instance, I've just redone nonfiction, and I don't have a religion section anymore. I have a culture and beliefs section that includes religion, mythology, folklore, these human beliefs. To me, I'm just, again, just trying things because we're still officially use Dewey. So I don't know if that's right or if it's wrong, but it feels better to me than Dewey's. So I'm trying it. So just playing around with it and trying when something doesn't feel right, just maybe trying to see if you can find something that feels better in the meantime until we all maybe come up with a perfect solution for all of this and can adopt it universally. That's the goal. But until then, we just try things, I guess.
I love it. Thank you. Rabia, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's so great, Kelsey. I think you really talk about like context and like looking at your context and sort of making the ways in which it's organized like contextual and tangible and accessible for your students. I really like that. I think for me, like one consideration is like thinking like individually but collectively of like the role the library has often played in our society, in our community. Oftentimes, libraries were like gatekeepers and storehouses of books and stories of like what matters to people and communities. And so to a degree, like libraries in some capacities have like become like museums in some ways, like, where we're like nervous to give up certain books or we're nervous to change things like so drastically. So I think just being aligned with like those conversations and just thinking about the historic role of the library, thinking about like the current role of the library, like what do you want your school library to be? You want it to be relevant, responsive. And so how are you going to like work towards a space that's evolving? And part of that evolvement is this idea of like how things are categorized and positioned and where they're positioned in the space. And so for me, like I think in terms of like subheadings or categorizing, I think if we're really trying to center voices which have historically been silenced or erased or like sidelined, I think we have to somehow go to the communities to find out like terminology and words that they will feel comfortable with being like represented with. And so I know that's going to take like really long, and there's so many different aspects to it. Like I don't really know how that works, but I think just having those conversations and thinking about the mindset, because for so long people have been like labeled, I think. And so for us to really move away from something that, or move towards something that's more inclusive, it's going to have to be like more of like a communal thing. And I think that it's going to take long to happen. But I think what we can do, like Kelsey stated, is to maybe work with what we have and think about our community, our context, think about the ages of our students. How can we make, the books accessible for them, particularly like nonfiction books at an elementary level, where like the whole section can be really like daunting and scary. And so a lot of the times, like in my experience, students will stay at like the fiction section because it's more accessible, or it's categorized more like accessibly for them. So I would say, like, what I've used in the past, and it's something that I'm still like learning more about, is just like themes that might be relevant and responsive for those students and communities that you're serving, and sort of like playing around with that. Like, yeah, I think that's kind of what I would advise. And I think just really thinking about the positionality of the library, and thinking about like where the changes need to happen first, because it is such a big, goal. Maybe targeting specific areas where you kind of see some problems, like Kelsey sort of said, like the religion section. I know that in my library, that was a place where we wanted to like really think critically about as well, because certain beliefs were put in the fantasy section or something like that, and we kind of wanted to like deconstruct that, like, and really position those beliefs and those identities and those experiences in a respectful way as well. So I think, thinking about the role of the library and thinking about what small steps we can take, and just thinking about these questions, I think is also like really empowering, to just think and consider, because that's when we think, when we can really then work towards like short-term and long-term goals that can help us work towards what we want to see, which is inclusive representation, and just also finding ways to bring in the communities and the voices and learning from them, even if we can't physically bring them in, like taking our own like initiative to maybe learn from those voices and think about, what are those conversations that are happening in the community about how folks have been represented in the past, what labels were used, and where are we going now. So just, yeah, like I guess it's like involving different people in terms of doing this work.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I mean, this whole subject, we could have a series, a months and years long series. So I really appreciate both of you just jumping in with both feet on these enormous questions and putting together this amazing panel. Thank you for your time and your energy. We have 7-ish minutes left. Does anyone have any questions, any thoughts? The chat is enabled. You can also now use the raise hand feature if you have a question for Kelsey or Rabia or both. I will call on you when I see you pop up or when I see you in the chat. All right, first question. So you were quick, Luana. How much time do you spend at work reading? Kelsey, go ahead.
I mean, none. I never read books. I read reviews a lot. I mean, that's probably what I read way more of, and blog posts to try to see what I put a lot of priority right now in trying to make sure that I'm listening to other voices and what they think about the books before I buy them. So like, that's what I read more of. So like I use TikTok a lot for this, to be honest, as you saw earlier, Adania. So like, if there's a book with a certain kind of representation, let's say Indigenous representation, I'm probably not going to read that book at work, but I'm probably going to be looking to find Indigenous readers and their reviews and reading how the books hit with them. So that's what I spent a lot more time doing. But in terms of the number of minutes, I don't know that I've ever clocked it really. So some weeks a lot, and some weeks not at all, I guess. It just depends. But usually I'm more reading about books than reading the books themselves.
She's clarified. Sorry, I meant after you bought them. Do you both read a lot of your collection? I know I do.
Yeah, I can. So, just being in elementary school, a lot of the books are like picture books. So I would say that I do spend like a fair amount of time like reading and like being really aware of the collection and where things are positioned and situated, and just knowing the books. I find that that helps me then like give recommendations to students, or if an educator needs a resource, like knowing where that, you know, resource is or what I can recommend them. So I think reading, like, sometimes will take a long time, but gradually reading, and I think knowing the collection helps me then make recommendations and really intentionally put out displays, or intentionally like curate those learning experiences, which you know, helps me a lot. And also, like Kelsey, I do spend time learning about different voices who might have reviewed certain books, because that helps me then look at the book in a particular way, because, you know, I have my own biases when I'm reading. And so reading other voices and other reviews helps me, you know, think critically about how this book will land with my students or my context, or yeah, like even help me think like, was this as great as I maybe initially thought it was, or this book is really great and I want to highlight it here and there. So just, yeah, like reading the book helps me know my collection like really well.
Wonderful, thank you. So a couple more things in the chat. Thank you both for this very interesting presentation. It made me think a lot about my choices, and I love that. I mean, I've been sitting here trying to focus on moderating, but I've just been absolutely captivated by the discussion. It's been fabulous. Another comment, as another presenter said this morning, when we start reading a book, we had an intention. Do you think it can be of use to exploit diverse books with another purpose, like connecting values? That's a big question. Dee Ramirez, can you take a quick moment and maybe?
Yes, sure. Hello. Can you hear
Hello,
me?
go ahead. Yeah.
Well, basically, what I mean is that if these diversity books can be used to make like I mean, they don't are not displayed just for Black Lives Matter Day or Passover, or just to put them together and to find like a cross-sectional, intersectional connection in terms of values. Let's say, I'm not saying just like like in the frame of a holiday or a day or special day or a commemorative thing, but just like how can I explore this in a different way?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How can the reader, or how can it be appreciated from a different perspective?
Okay, Kelsey or Rabia, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think I know what you mean, and yeah, definitely that's been something I've been working hard on. I feel like when the first effort for me to try to develop an inclusive collection, a lot of the books were very kind of I don't know what's the word, but like specific in like a certain representation would have a certain topic. And so like a Black representation in a YA book would often deal with the topic in the US, at least, with police brutality, for example. So like learning to move past that sort of one specific type of representation or type of experience into more universally, I think that is so important that we're aware of. And they often say stories with Black joy, for example, instead, like making sure that this, so yeah. So like, for example, if I choose a common theme of family, like here we're going to put a book list that deals with family, then you making sure you're choosing books that have all different kinds of families and the different kinds of ways culture impacts families, and yeah, to connect to a common theme rather than to one specific type of experience. I think that's very important to be cognizant of, and it is a bias we do have to, I think, intentionally bypass, because we can be sort of get stuck into like a rut, I guess, in what kind of representation. Yeah.
Absolutely. Courtney just dropped into the chat, shared human experiences we can connect with. And that's absolutely true. And that's where, I mean, if we have the time to read the books in their entirety, sure, like learn the stories, and then we can start creating these constellations of things that, maybe from the outside in look like they don't have anything in common when absolutely they do. Brandy Wiggins says, this presentation has my gears turning. Well done. I love it. Me too, Brandy. Absolutely. Lumi, I see your hand up. Go ahead. We're a little over time, but I think we have time for one more question.
I hope this won't take too long. Thank you so much. I've loved your presentation, both of you. But my question, I think, is more for Kelsey. You said your religion section, you're working on it, and it's a big one. It's difficult in high school to deal with that. And so what did you do? You put all your 200 books and 390 together? Or because in 390s we have customs and folklore, right? So that, I think, would go also with the beliefs. I'm saying, So, and then did you give them different numbers, or did you classify them differently? What did you do?
Yeah, so I am working on a blog post to describe all of this in depth. But yes, the religions section has been my biggest headache since I started to rethink Dewey, and I was annoyed because we would find Wicca in the 100s, and then we would find other philosophy in the 100s, and then some religions in the 200s, mostly Abrahamic religions, and then in the 390s, whatever Dewey decided was mythology instead of religion, which in my mind, as they are not different, those are to me the same. It's the same kind of stories. So there's a lot of bias in what you decide what's a mythology versus what's a religious, right? So I've put them all together. I've created a new section. I've gotten rid of Dewey, so I don't use his numbers anymore. And I played with adapting a version of BSAC, which is the book industry standard of classification, which tends to use words more than numbers. So you would say this is the religion section or the belief section or whatever, instead of giving it like a number. So I now have what I'm calling for now culture and human stories belief section, and I have philosophy, what Dewey called religion, what Dewey called mythology, and Wicca, like everything I think that is folklore, like things that are like, to me, is like the human storytelling. It's not really fiction, but it's not really nonfiction the way we think of it either. It's kind of that stuff. To me, they all make sense together. And so I tried to put them together, and it really annoyed me the way he separated mythology from religion. So that part I felt like I had to try to fix, and I probably didn't get it perfect and get it right because I'm not a religion expert, but I feel like we're moving the needle, like always just trying to move the needle to make it better. You're not always going to get perfect, but the religion one was a big one for me because I think it says a lot. I think when you have 80 numbers out of 100 assigned to Christianity, and that you have 20 assigned to others that are mostly Abrahamic, and then the other things aren't even allowed to be in that section. To me, that's like a big issue. So that was something I targeted for, as Rabia said earlier, like you have to target what you can deal with, what you can try to work on now. You have to like triage, For me, the religion section was a place to triage because it just felt too biased. I had to try something. So it's still a work in progress.
Totally agree. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Lumi. Absolutely. I mean, libraries, when I first started, one of my mentors sent me a beautiful plaque that she made. And it says on it, working in the library is a marathon, not a sprint. And so I have that across from my desk in my office, just so that every now and again, when I'm feeling completely overwhelmed by all of it, I just look up and I'm reminded of that. Libraries are dynamic places, right? If we're doing it right, they're dynamic. They're always changing. They're, like you said, relevant and responsive. Rabia, really quickly, because we have to switch gears into our next session. Anything you want to add? Any final thoughts?
No, it's been really great, like thinking about all of this stuff. And I really, what stands out for me is just embedding representation in all aspects of our collection, and really bringing forward those universal themes. And so, everyone should be able to see themselves in all types of themes, and really moving away from categories that have often harmed and silenced voices, and just, showing our intersectional experiences, and really thinking of the library as a place of community. And really, the collection tells a story. So, like, what story does your collection tell, and who does it include? Who does it center? And how do we just continue working individually and collectively to ensure all voices are represented in all areas?
Absolutely. Thank you. Kelsey, any last thoughts?
This is just great. Thanks for having me. I guess I just would encourage librarians to, if we sort of accept this freedom that comes with knowing it's okay to let go of the way we've always done things, like that's what I kind of try to encourage us to do, is like to just like let it go. Like, okay, yes, it's always been done this way, but it doesn't mean it has to still be done that way. So there's some freedom that comes with that, letting go of tradition and status quo, and just thinking, what could be, what could happen, what could I do? So I just try to encourage, like, you might have heard us talk about all this stuff, and you might be thinking, well, I don't have the staff or resources or time to do a big weed, or to do a whole diversity audit, or to do this. So just switching gears, instead of thinking about what you can't do, like, what can you do? And I think, as Rabia said this earlier, like, maybe there's something small that you could do right now. Like, what's the small thing that's been irking you, annoying you, or your mind's been puzzling over, that maybe you can't ditch Dewey, but maybe you could reassign books on a certain topic to an unused number in Dewey just to get them out of a harmful location. Maybe, what could you do? Like, for me, that was one of the first things I did, was just our queer books in nonfiction were in the crime section under Dewey. That was a huge issue for me. So I was like, okay, I can't ditch Dewey right now this week, but I could take these books and I could look for a different unused number elsewhere, and I could just get those books, as a Band-Aid for right now, get them out. So think about, like, the little things you can do, and, then we build, you build momentum as you go. But instead of worrying about, I can't do this, I can't do diversity, I can't do this, like, there are little things that we can do to move the needle. So that's, I think, what sometimes our priority has to be, because, as you just said, it's perfect. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. You got to just take the step, right? So
absolutely. Thank you both. Our opening keynote this morning, one of the things that really resonated with me was the question, what are you doing to help? And I think that it's kind of come through the whole day. How are you listening? A diversity mindset as our everyday, right? Thank you both so much for everything that you've put into the day. It's been many months in coming, and I appreciate all your patience and all your work. Thank you. Thank you to Kim, who was our closed captioner for this session. Thank you as well to Lily Sun, who was our technician, taking care of all the bells and whistles in the background.